right. Hey, everybody. My name is Jeff, and you are looking at me for the first time doing my very first Real Estate Matters podcast as a VCast. And so this is going to be on the BBN 31 YouTube channel, which we haven't had before. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that all plays out. Now, don't kill the messenger here, but I'm probably going to be a little bit slow for a while. I've done a ton of episodes for the radio, but you've never had to see me before, and I've never had the graphics. But anyway, today what we're doing is we're doing the starter home. So this is going to be on the Vanishing starter home. Now, Jeff, what exactly does that mean to us? Why are we talking about the starter home, and why are we talking about it being vanishing? So I'm going to give you a little history lesson before we get further into this. On Real Estate Matters, what I try to do is try to talk to you about what it is that buyers and sellers need advice-wise. And we also do stories that I find interesting. Well, I read this story about the Vanishing starter home and why it is so hard for people in their 20s and early 30s to get into a home. And that's what this episode's going to be about, because I think that we kind of have an idea. We actually do have an idea. And it has a lot to do with, of course, it has a lot to do with money, right? Okay. Now, the starter home traditionally was where a young family would start. That's why we called it a starter home. It was usually on the one lower end of the market, lower 1/3 of the market, were starter homes. So those homes would typically be between 900 and 1,400 square feet. They would typically have 2 to 3 bedrooms. They would typically have one bathroom, and that one bathroom usually was a shared bathroom and a hallway. They would typically be in older neighborhoods, and you could afford the monthly payment. And they were built specifically for first-time home buyers. You can see this in a lot of neighborhoods and cities around. We live in Oregon, so around Oregon, you can see this. What these homes are is they become that first place that you start. You get in, you put down your money, and you start building equity. And you did that in your 20s, and it becomes the stepping stone to your next home. Okay, now we're going to take a look. I want to show you what this starter home typically looked like, because we're not talking about a mansion here. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is something like this. This is what a starter home used to look like. Now, this is a typical late 70s, early 80s starter home right here. You had one, maybe 1.5 car garage. You might be able to get your car in there. You've seen cars from the 70s and 80s. They probably fit in there. And then you had 2 bedrooms. You had a bath, and even if you had 2 baths, they were both public. You weren't going to have a bathroom in the master. There was no master. You just had 3 bedrooms. That's because it was a starter home. But I want you to pay attention to this one thing about it, is that they tended to be, and we'll get back to that in a minute. They tended to be lower quality products in the home. So, for example, Formica countertops instead of quartz countertops. You might have linoleum flooring or rugs instead of hardwood floor. These houses were built for people in the first 1/3 of the market. So you have 1/3 of the market is going to be lower end, then you have the middle class market, and then you have the upper class market. And it was that way for many, many, many years. So what this house costs in 2025 dollars is about $150,000. What you made in 2025, what a typical household income was in 2025 dollars during the same period of time was around $82,000 to $85,000 a year. So you can see that your income was about half of what your house cost. Okay, that's important to understand, because when we get into our next segment, you're going to see why that's important. You're going to see what I'm talking about. So when my wife and I bought our first house in 1993, it cost $72,000 in 1993 dollars, and it was a great house. We borrowed $3,000. We saved $10,000, and we put down that money, and we had a 10% interest rate. 5 years later, we sold the house for $116,000. That was a starter home. So why are they disappearing? Why are these homes going away? Why aren't we building this home anymore? That's the question. Okay, so some of the reasons why would be construction costs. It costs a lot more to build a house these days. Back in the day, you didn't have as much regulation, you didn't have as much permitting fees, the cost of lumber, the cost of the roof, the windows, that stuff didn't cost that much. So we're paying a lot more for permits, we're paying a lot more for insurance, we're paying a lot more for materials, and builders were earning, a good amount of money making these back in the day. Nowadays, that margin is not there, so they end up building bigger homes today. So we're going to get a sense of what that is now. And when I look down, it's because I have these controls that I'm trying to figure out how to use. And eventually I won't be looking down as much, but this is just, it's the start of something new. So that's what it is. Okay. And I know you guys understand. So let's go ahead and move into our next slide. Now, why are America's starter homes vanishing? And we've just talked about this. In 2025, the typical starter home was 1,200 to 1,800 square feet, and it would look more like this. It'd be more like a row house. You have certainly less yard, and you certainly have to be a little bit more, have saved a little bit more money to get into it. Now you can see here the disparity in the cost of the house versus your income, right? So $450,000 is what gets you into one of these average. You still have the 3-bedroom, 2-bath. But unfortunately, the typical income for today is around $97,000. That's what an average family makes. So that's nearly a quarter of what it costs, or less than a quarter of what it costs to buy the house. And back in the 1980 model, if you remember that one, it was not that much, right? In the 80s model, we'll go back and look at that, it was half. 82,000 was about half of what a house would cost. So the skyrocketing cost of housing really comes down to the fact that your income has not kept up with the cost of housing. That's part of the vanishing, the magic trick here. Why we've seen so much disparity in housing. So I would say also that we have issues with zoning. So zoning laws have changed. They become more complicated, especially in Oregon. Many cities have parking requirements. Might not have been the case in the 70s. There were larger lots in the 70s and 80s. There were setback requirements that determine a minimum house size. And so all these things that happen, all these legislative things that happen, become zoning issues, become permitting issues. And the regulatory environment is more stringent than it was in the 70s and 80s. And that makes sense, right? Because you don't want to be building a house on top of an industrial zone, for example. So I would say the other part of this equation is also that we have investor buying. This is something that's come up on the recent bill that's before Congress, before President Trump. It's looking like big institutional investors are going to be discouraged, maybe even enforced getting out of residential zones, which would be great. I don't know if that'll bring the cost down or not, but it's a step in the right direction. What has happened to a lot of these starter homes that we used to have in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and what they are now, what happens is because you have investors buying them, you have investors buying into these properties, what ends up happening, which is unfortunate for everybody that's doing this, is that you get investors buying the house and then they rent it back to people. They make them short-term or mid-term rentals, so they become investment properties. This is a huge thing, especially if you think you can get a 20% return on your dollar. Well, then you're going to see people investing in properties, right? Okay, let's do this buying power thing then versus now. So we have 1980 first-time buyer has $84,000. The home price is $150,000. That approximately means the house costs about 1.8% of the income. The family earning 84,000 could realistically start in a home that looked like this. You've seen this house. You've seen this house all over the place wherever you live. This is a typical ranch with a garage underneath, and you walk up some stairs. It's a split level ranch, right? They're all over the place. They're very cheap. It's just a big box with 3 or 4 bedrooms in it. And then it's got a living room, kitchen, dining upstairs, and it's got a family room downstairs and a garage. That's how they're set up. You might have 2.5 baths in there. This is more of a typical 80s style, getting to the top end of a starter home in the 80s. Okay. Now we have houses that look more like this. They're not, their neighborhoods are built by huge companies like D.L. Horton Properties or Hayden Homes, big companies like that. Now, this is going to be a little deceptive because those big builders give people investment, give people better interest rates, but they also give you a higher price. So the first-time home buyer in 2025 is generating about 95 to 100,000 in income, but the average house is between 420 and 450 to get into it as a starter home. Like again, a 3 bedroom, 2 bath, and you might have a 2-car garage or 1-car garage. The price is approximately 4 times your income. That's much harder to do on your budget, especially if the interest rate goes up. Now, what we see here is that incomes have risen 13% since 1980 in 2025 dollars, and home costs have risen 180% since 1980. Wow. Wow. Do the math on that. That's huge. And that's part of the reason that we see a crisis in the housing market. And that's also part of the reason why we see opportunities going away for first-time home buyers. So in addition to all of that, we also have rising land prices, especially in places like Oregon, where we have artificial boundaries around each of our cities. So for example, Redmond has an urban growth boundary. Salem has an urban growth boundary. If there's an urban growth boundary, you are going to pay more money for that property inside that boundary because you can't build outside the boundary. That's the problem. So land is expensive because of the boundary in Oregon. In other places, the land might not be as expensive, but it is going to be expensive compared to the building costs in a lot of places. And again, we could go into that in future episodes. Now, we're going to wrap up this episode by just saying that when you're thinking about a starter home, the idea is that you want to save as much as you can, as long as you can, and try to get into something. You want to borrow money from friends, from relatives, whoever can help you. You can also do some hacks once you're into the house. You can rent out bedrooms to your friends. You want to figure out a way to buy that house. It's still going to be a great investment for you, even if it's going to cost more than it did in 1980. Okay. I think I'm going to stop this by saying that when you think about buying a home, you don't get the easy route like we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Unfortunately, what's replaced the starter home is usually a townhouse, a condo, things that traditionally are not really there anymore because you've got big home builders, you have big condo associations, you have huge apartment complexes going in, and these things cost money too. So townhomes you're going to see a lot more of them. And you see them already on the East Coast. So it's not like you don't see these in older cities. But in the West Coast, you're going to start seeing a lot more of these. Okay. That is going to wrap it up for Real Estate Matters. Thank you for being here with me today. And hopefully future episodes will be a little less chaotic anyway. All right, everybody. Have a great day.